In one of Jesus' parables, he begins by telling us about a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. It's not a very hopeful beginning, and sure enough, it doesn't take long for us to learn that in the same city where this judge was, there was also a widow who sought the protection of the law. J.B. Phillips translated her cry like this: "Please protect me from the man who is trying to ruin me." As we'd expect, the judge refuses. He won't help her at all. That much all feels predictable, right? What else could have happened? The decision seemed already made. There isn't much room for hope either, because we already know what the judge is like. He doesn't fear God, and he doesn't respect people. In the setup, this is sad then, but unsurprising. So we have to listen just a little bit longer. In that city, there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my accuser." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." It's a kind of story that can both amuse and then haunt you. I can imagine, in fact, the hearers chuckling at the image of this self-important judge being followed and harassed by a persistent widow until he finally gives in to her demands. But after a little reflection, the story lingers and it touches our own memories and our own unfulfilled hopes. We realize that, as funny as it is, this is a story of desperation, driving a woman to defy social conventions and expectations. What would cause a person to take such a risk? It's likely that she was trying to secure her financial future after the death of her husband. Especially if there hadn't been a written agreement, other family members could have made a claim on what was owed to her. Losing that claim would have meant certain poverty and probably starvation and even death. The Torah provided protections for just such situations, as Rav Benjamin Zimmerman explained, that the Torah singles out people who are particularly vulnerable, such as orphans and widows, explicitly because their unfortunate circumstances often leave them unable to demand or defend their rights. The Torah, to quote Rav Benjamin, the Torah prohibits afflicting them, while simultaneously requiring that they receive preferential kindness. The Torah doesn't stop with the prohibition. It goes on to express the utter disdain that God has for those who violate it, and the harshness that will be displayed against perpetrators of this conduct. The message is clear. Not only is it forbidden, but it will not be tolerated in any manner. And this isn't an understatement. In one of the most famous versions of this code in the Torah, in Exodus 22, for example, we read, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives will become widows and your children orphans." That's very tough stuff. So we have a tradition that explicitly sets out to protect vulnerable people. Moreover, it promises that if they're not protected, their cries against injustice will be heard and divine wrath will kill the abusers. The threat is stark. He's saying, if you abuse the orphan and the widow, then you're inviting your own death. Your own children and wives will become orphans and widows. To abandon and abuse the vulnerable was to abandon and abuse the covenant, and to make the community itself vulnerable to the violence of powerful enemies and empires. That's what being pursued by the sword meant. And Jesus' story holds all of these elements, all of these familiar elements, except for it adds this wrinkle. The judge isn't playing by these rules. The judge is unjust. He can't be motivated or persuaded by a fear of God, not even that burning wrath, or by a concern for humans, not even a vulnerable one. He's a bad man, to be sure, But we know a situation like this requires more than just one bad person, right? More than just a single greedy judge. The law was supposed to prevent just this kind of thing. And it's not easy to get people to go along with blatantly rejecting something central to their culture. A more subtle touch is required. In this case, you needed to rely on the hard work of scribal retainers who could help massage those troublesome laws into a more exploitable shape. As William Herzog describes it, the task of scribal retainers was to recodify laws in such a way that they seemed to support justice, while actually protecting and expanding the prerogatives of the ruling elites. In other words, law codes were part of the cover story, the pursuit of justice that masked the real story, the extension of power and control. The setting of Jesus' story, then, it didn't happen by accident. The kind of injustice the widow experienced was by design. That a judge could come to power who didn't care about justice or compassion was also by design. That somebody was ready and willing to expose a human being to poverty in order to expand their wealth or extend their power was by design. And that was the heart of the injustice. Someone was willing to use the widow's vulnerable position as an opportunity for their own gain, and the judge was inclined to let them get away with it. There's some probability that this was how the judge even made his own living, taking a cut when those with more power used the court to rob those with less power, the most vulnerable. The ideas of justice are turned on their head. Instead of protecting the marginalized, the system is used to further exploit them. So the widow faced an impossible dilemma. The judge has such a reputation that a quiet appeal to either the Torah or their common humanity seemed likely to fail. But to give up her claim altogether is likely the same as giving up on life, cast aside into a desperate economic situation. So she decided to go public. She wouldn't leave the judge alone. Herzog points out that her persistence is also in her focus. She doesn't denounce the judge. She doesn't try to appeal either to his honor or his compassion. Instead, she is just unrelenting in her demand for justice, turning the tables on a system that wore down the vulnerable. She wore out the judge. Later, he said to himself, though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because the widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so she won't wear me out. That's a situation we can recognize, isn't it? From the protester marching in the streets to the whistleblower handing over evidence, unjust systems don't usually celebrate their injustice. No, they like to keep their oppression hidden, right? And they often even publicly champion the ideals that they privately undermine. As Walter Wink has expressed it, when anyone steps outside of the system and tells the truth, lives the truth, that enables everyone else to peer behind the curtain too. Anyone who steps out of line, therefore, denies it in principle and threatens it in its entirety. If the main pillar of the system is living a lie, then it's not surprising that the fundamental threat to it is living the truth. And that's what the widow was doing, living the truth. It's possible that the judge gave in to the widow in a calculated move. The case could have become too risky, and the financial loss of siding with the widow cost less than what it could have become a public outcry. Besides, giving in to her demands could then be used to prop up the court's own reputation for justice, providing the unjust judge better cover for future injustices. The story doesn't even include any heartfelt, happy anecdotes about how the judge or how the widow's adversary had a change of heart. There's no indication that the system itself has been changed. Doubtless, a similar situation would happen again soon enough, and doubtless, different strategies would need to be used in the future. But at least at this moment, the widow was heard, her needs were met, and there was just a little more justice in the world. That's a glimmer of hope for everyone who, like the widow, is pushing back against injustice. We know something of what it feels like to exist in a world where oppression is so commonplace that it just feels normal. We know something of what it feels like to accommodate injustice by all the little necessities of life. With a guilty wave of the hand, I don't like it, but that's just the way it is. There are so many things to protest, so many issues that are important and urgent, so many ways to become overwhelmed. And that, too, is part of the point. Luke prefaces the parable with his own explanation for the tale. Jesus shared this story in order to remind us to pray always and not lose heart. Today we might talk about activist burnout or compassion fatigue, climate anxiety, or racial equity fatigue. Across centuries and cultures, we can recognize one another. We know what it means to look honestly at all the urgent issues of the day and feel ourselves quivering under the weight. We know what it means to lose heart. I thought a long time about the connections this story has with both humans' long history of injustice and our current headlines. In the end, I decided to just let this story stand as it is. It's likely that your heart has already been making those connections. We can recognize a world where those in need are ignored by those in power, where those in power are unjust, and where the marginalized and oppressed must wear themselves out just to be heard. There is a feeling, a familiar feeling, of justice being delayed, and more than this, justice delayed so long that justice seekers lose heart and give up. In Jesus' story, faith is depicted as persistence in the face of that long delay. Readers and scholars have often concluded that the story was especially included to encourage the early church to persevere during times of persecution. Luke extends the story with a brief commentary, comparing an unjust judge with a just God who promises that long-delayed justice will be real and very soon. Behind this is a confidence that it is the unjust judge who is an aberration, the thing that doesn't fit. That, as Martin Luther King Jr. taught us, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This is a matter of faith, though not a believe this or else kind of mental assent. Instead, it's a kind of confidence that what we are doing in the cause of justice is worthwhile, even when the results seem far off. If Jesus' parable is meant to encourage us to not lose heart, it then has to include this reminder to recognize and celebrate the small moments. In the story, the parable, was the judge or the adversary transformed? No. Was the standard of protecting the vulnerable restored in the court? No. Did the public show up in solidarity with a fellow human being in need? No, not that we know of. There was not risk that this victory would be confused with the just, compassionate kingdom that Jesus' followers were waiting for. But did a widow win her claim and avoid getting crushed under the economic and patriarchal violence of her city? Yes. And did her story help keep alive a vision that something could be different, and that those differences are worth working together to make into something real? Yes. There are all sorts of ways to lose heart, whatever name we give it. In a chapter on non-attachment to outcomes, Donald Rothberg points out some of the ways that we may shy away from committed action. He includes these: losing sight of our deeper intentions, fear of acting authentically, despair, burnout, and a sense of powerlessness, and spiritual suspicions about committed action. If our compassion and wisdom are dependent on getting the perfect outcome, then they will inevitably fail. What is required is training our heart minds to know and practice compassion and wisdom, even in the face of limited success, even in failure. Because the less dependent the heart mind is on what Tanisarow Bhikkhu calls a tender web of beliefs and feelings, the more able we are to relax into the compassion and wisdom that we've developed. And this is why I always emphasize cultivating some kind of reflective or spiritual practice in so much of the community work that I do. And with that in mind, It's useful to remember that even small practices can make a big difference. We're aiming for creating habits that strengthen the heart. For example, for decades now, every time I sit down to meditate, I set a simple intention. In these next moments, may I be present with my experience with openness, kindness, and gratitude, so that wisdom has a chance to arise. That simple aspiration, I found, worked itself into more and more moments of my life, so that now I often catch myself resolving to be present with openness, kindness, and gratitude whenever I start a new task or find myself in a difficult or stressful situation. Because when we practice in this way, those qualities become a resource to us, even when conditions are not ideal, even when the conditions would otherwise overwhelm us. So in the end, when I hear Jesus' parable, I hear also this admonition: to not lose heart, we must train the heart. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.